This is probably the beginning of or part of the Chinatown section of Ramblas, which, as Rick points out, has absolutely no connection to anything that can be found that's Chinese, but merely refers to an old prejudice that the Chinese were the center point of crime, prostitution, drug dealing, etc. in the old days. A lovely umbrella motif, eh? An interesting balcony, really. This is the tower of the Church of Santa Maria del Pi, a medieval. Theoretically, this building was built in 1789. It's right next to this big church we just looked at, Santa Maria del Pi. Or Pi. Sounds politically more correct. And the facade of the church. Romanesque, to say the least. Notice the tiny little statues and those arched recesses there that had to hold statues at one time. Had to hold. Were they just simply torn down during some era? Distributed to somebody's estate? It's a museum, and I don't want to spend €3 to go inside and look at stuff I don't want to see. The rich color of that stained glass is intriguing. This is a pretty little square with a lovely building. I'm guessing that's Art Deco. It may just be an pretty evidence of its time, this nice beveled glass entryway with this rounded piece of glass, big piece of glass. Imagine what that's worth. And here an oval glass entry, and all those pieces are beveled. Beautiful cabinetry inside. Standing with the church behind me, I think this would be a lovely place to live if you had a reason to have to live in Barcelona, in the city. About a half a block off to the Ramblas to the right. Look at these beautiful and massive lights. This one, Carrier de la Boquiera, which is the name of that big market we were at. Now we'll turn back down to that main street we were on. The Chinese building represents the center or halfway point of the Ramblas walk, and this abstract design is by Joan Miró, one of the great Spanish Cataluna artists, known for his playful designs. And this, the Teatro de Iglesia, however you pronounce it, the Opera House of Barcelona, and it's right next to that metro station. Which suggests that we've seen the best of Las Ramblas walk, and that from here on it's not all downhill, figuratively and literally, although that's interesting. This is a lovely building, in part because of the purple shutters. Also has KFC, and next to it is American Embassy. Here, another little pretty building. Imagine living up there, having all of this entertainment. Arcaded lane called Calle de Colón takes us down to this plaza. Colonnaded square comes gratis from the church, because I think it was in the 1700s or 1800s, Spain threw the church out, or at least one element. The monastery shut them all down, turned them all into public places. What we're actually looking at here is the cloisters of a monastery, and then these shops would have been added on to it as a building was built over it, and it's turned into this public square. And for a lovely touch of elegance, particularly if you happen to live in one of these buildings, are these palm trees. And that beautiful light standard there. And the lovely fountain in the center. This now is, to me, a classically beautiful square. Of course, imagine it at night. Without even seeing it, you can imagine it's going to be jammed and fun. We'll wander around the complete cloister now just for the fun of it. Secondary entrance into the plaza, which is far, far more interesting, really. What was this? Were these just two very old buildings? No, this is an arcade that was developed, and it's covered, so this was an intentional shopping arcade. Let's take a closer look at one panel of the detail. How long have these shops been here? You can only imagine the grief of the priests if they could have realized, if they just waited a few centuries, how much fun they could have had underneath these arches. Keep you nice and warm on this a little bit windy and chilly, particularly in the shade day, but otherwise a gorgeous day. Short because it's all restaurants. Now, what is most remarkable and memorable about these helmeted light fixtures is they are Antoni Gaudi's first public efforts in 1897, I believe. We first encountered Antoni at Santiago Compostela. Now, interesting, this street takes me down to my hostel. Okay, this was one of Anton Gaudi's first and darker period public buildings. It's an apartment is what it really is. It was done in 1897. It isn't hard to recognize that it's different. We're used to seeing two parabolic entrances. The parabolic entrances are novel in themselves, of course, but then that centerpiece is strangely novel. You wonder what he thought the symbolisms should be in this, and were they related to the owner of the apartment? Is this a faux helmet in the center there that the bird's resting on? And the balcony up there? And notice his overall allusion to the balconies of Spain and Portugal and other countries that stick out a little bit from the face of the building. And up on top we'll look at a couple of strange finials, for lack of a better term. Art Deco, curvy, ice creamy looking, Baskin Robbins looking. And then what was the purpose of that? Just a protective barrier added sometime after. And are those flower pots part of the balcony? It seems so. Look at the massiveness of this wrought iron. This serpent motif. Imagine working in that. I mean, molding or moving, shaping that iron. That must have taken a skill jump for whoever the artisans were. And here to get that light, almost feathery, leafy feeling to it. And there what looked like multiple colors of metal. Is it brass or something? I don't know. And the bird, what kind of a bird is that? This building interesting, of course, because of the tile work. We haven't seen this much overt exterior tile work since Portugal, I think. At this point, Las Ramblas widens, and it's now the Raval neighborhood over on the right-hand side, or Barri Gotic, and this is the area that apparently is called Chinatown, with the comment I made earlier about it having nothing to do with China. Here, another interesting building with Art Deco overlays. And the building to my right is being restored. Maybe this one will also have left bank type of artwork and little stands for that. A couple of older interesting buildings. Very pretty balcony. Very different balcony on the left. Notice that sign, 1845, or at least the structure. Speaks of this as the seedy area, and granted the buildings aren't as pretty looking and there's a sparsity of them. But he says this is the place where prostitutes used to hang out. There are people with shell games. I don't see any evidence of that, but that would be more likely in the evening. You see, my hostel's right down the street from here. I don't know how far down the street from here it is, but it is. This is Edificio Colón, the first skyscraper built in Catalunya, Barcelona in 1970. This is a water feature that probably has seen better days, or at least more fully operative, and probably a drinking fountain there. The back of it is interesting. It seems to illustrate what characterized this area. Showbiz, clowns, the church. More showbiz, the rockin' 20s, film industry, transportation. Probably characters that are famous and recognized by a Spanish person. Down ahead of us is the Columbus monument that celebrates the time that Columbus stopped here on his way back from his first visit to the North American continent. This is the Museum of Wax, or the Wax Museum. Here's some of the street performers. They're limited to 15. They have to have the skills. They have to have a license. When you drop a coin in their box, they will start to animate Columbus. Pretty impressive monument, actually. One of the most impressive I've ever seen, I think. Spectacular building over there. Lions are falling apart. Looking back up Ramblas. It'll be exciting at night. Some impressive buildings. The Port of Barcelona, Art Deco for sure, or Art Nouveau, I'm not sure which. Pan all around 360 here at the bottom of the Ramblas. Columbus's statue. This building, I have no idea what it is. And their cable car that apparently takes you from far over to the left, maybe even up on top of that site up there, whose name I can't pronounce, but it starts like an M, like a Montague or something. And that cable car, don't know what those rings are for, like. This seems to be a very impressive area, relatively speaking. This is called Ramblas Mar, and it's an extension of the Ramblas out over the water. And apparently you can make a loop. I'm going to go down the Esplanade here and then loop back around, I guess. Hopefully they got bathrooms somewhere. Kind of anorexic and or tall and skinny mermaids, but those sailors have been out to sea for quite a while. Interesting sculpture, ship on top, and then the waves and the fish diving down underneath it. It's a very pretty, modernistic park at this end of the Ramblas Mar. Beautiful modernistic lines to it. Modern plastic sailboat. Seems to take away one of the ambiances or allures of the nostalgia of sailing. Here the clever design includes teak wood, an allusion to boating. Do you think McDonald's wants to establish and or maintain its image down here? One of the great benefits and purposes of this extension of the Ramblas is that here is a large mall. Mall should have bathrooms, and Scott likes bathrooms. An African country that is, I think, was one of the colonies of Spain, so they get access into Spain. Looking back to the center where I was, or the square that I was on, there's the Columbus Monument, of course. And somewhere over there is where that cable car takes you up to the top of this, I think, somehow. I know there's a funicular that goes up there. That there's two sections of this bridge or walkway that pivot right on this thing here, and one over on that side, opening up this channel. This is a pretty sculpture, apparently alluding to the Olympics. The boy appears to be immersed in, or standing in a pool of water, and then it slowly drains over the side. Here we're apparently at some part of the original wall that didn't get torn down for whatever the reason. And if this is really authentic, it may suggest that there was a moat around it. Again, if this is original, this may support that. These two slots here probably held chains that could lift up a drawbridge over the moat. And I'm just guessing, but that there either was a place that you could stand out over, or maybe it was open and they could pour oil down it, or both. And maybe some kind of chain went through that hole right there. This is probably the easiest system to use. The lights are solid when they've gone to a stop. One light on the left will start blinking as that's our next stop, but that by implication shows you the direction. Okay, this morning we're starting from Cataluna Square and going down the Porto del Angel. This area that we'll be exploring is called the Barri Gotic, or another way of saying it, the Barrio Gothic, the old town. Doesn't look like it from here, so let's see what happens. So this is Cataluna's birthplace, Barcelona's birthplace. Originally a Roman city of Barcino down here. We'll see a little bit of that. Okay, so what we're eventually going to be looking at is the Barcelona's birthplace. A place where the ancient Romans built the city, medieval Christians built a cathedral, and where Barcelonans lived within a ring of protective walls until 1850. When the city expanded and they tore all those walls down, except for, I think, some remnants we'll see later today. The early history of Barcelona, this was one of the ports, or one of the gates into the city, or ergo Puerta del Angel, the port of the... This is El Corte Inglés, the largest department store chain in Spain, and I think I saw it in Portugal. But if my attempt to buy DVDs, cassettes, is any indication, by that I mean mini cassettes from my Sony video camera, it's not, at least from my viewpoint, well managed from the consumer. Now, Rick Steve says this is Art Nouveau, so if I can only figure out what Art Nouveau is versus Art Deco, I think Art Deco may refer more to decoration like furniture, some art, glassware, that sort of thing, whereas Art Nouveau refers to this kind of circular, elegant, faux Roman or Grecian architecture. Notice that says labor, I think. Up there used to be a statue of an angel. Theoretically, she was the protector of the city against plagues and that sort of thing. Now we're going to detour to the right to the Church of Saint-Anne. We're seeing croissants this large. Presumably they're for real. Yep, $5.50 a piece. It's kind of like a group or convention. It's interesting that further on in the guidebook he talks about the attribute for identifying the synagogue that we'll see later today, in that it sits cattywampus from the rest of the buildings around it because it faces east to Jerusalem. But then look at the orientation of this church to these. It's also catty. So it's a 12th century church when she refers to this as a marker cross. I've never heard this referred to as a marker cross or even heard of a marker cross, but I wonder if that's some of what I saw when we were hiking the Camino Santiago, and these crosses would be sitting out in the middle of tules. If they were marker cross for prior churches, that would make some sense. The interior, we're looking at a Romanesque church, very simple in its ornamentation. We're looking at a Romanesque interior with a Greek cross floor plan. So I'm standing at what normally would be the main entrance, and there, it should be, I believe, facing the east, is the altar, and then the transept going from left to right. Interesting how in its simplicity, even in the 12th century, it's still more decorated than the average mosque today. These were probably lit by candle initially. Maybe there are lights in there now, I don't know. Very intricate octagonal tower or dome. I don't know if this canopy over the altar is an original device or a more recent device in the 12th century, but notice how it still hides that stained glass up above, at least a portion, particularly the closer you get to the altar. You wonder what the age of the stained glass is. The Virgin there. It's a very pretty canopy, making the altar a little bit more intimate, at least for the people who are officiating. It's interesting to see how this detailed, ornate, Gothic-looking sculpture was a precursor to this same kind of sculpture in and on the walls themselves in the future. Notice how in the bottom stone of this tomb in the floor, there's a little iron loop by which you could pull that up as though someone had intentions of going into the tomb again. Imagine how important the person must have been in the 12th century to have been buried here. And what was their life like? Here an interesting tableau of sculptures. Almost real size. And maybe in their time they were the size of humans. I'm guessing that these were post-Renaissance, in other words, after the 14th century, because they reflect more emotion like this man here, second from the left, than you would have found prior to 1400, except for some of Giotto's work, I guess. And yet as I pan these faces close up, you will see some that appear to be a little more authentic than others, but interesting. Look at how reflective her face is. Mary. And this one almost angelically silly looking. Notice the skull and crossbones motif. Considering that only the most important and or wealthiest people were buried in the church on the main aisle in such a big stone space as this, 4 stone component. And imagine after you were buried and dead, your friends equally as wealthy and powerful who sat in these pews might necessarily have walked across your tomb. A weekly reminder of your association with that person. Here a simple but pretty chapel, probably of later period. What this elegant lower part of this building is, but the wrought iron gate is fantastic, and in the same style, these arches here, and also the balconies, it appears. Was this a hotel, an original one of some sort? Whatever, it's a restaurant and a bar now. It's actually the original site of Els Quatre Gats, or the Four Cats. It's a restaurant built by a man in the 1890s that, as legend goes, it was built off the main drag that we've just walked down from, and it is alleged that only he and his 4 cats would ever visit it. The irony is it became for Barcelona what Le Chat Noir is for Paris, and that is the center of intellectual and art habitus, if I pronounce that right, people like Picasso and others who gathered here. Not only did Picasso hang out here, but it's also where he first hung his paintings when he was between the ages, I think, around 16. At a fork in the road is a fountain that we're going to look more closely at. And Rick calls these fountains, whereas I've been unsure what to call them, but what they are is public sources of water. And here, the green and yellow blue tiles depict women carrying water, but it was the last place in, I think, the 12th century that you could water your horse before you left the city, which is behind me at that Porto Angel, or Port of the Angel. It's out as late as 1940, 80%. Barcelona's got their water from such fountains, and it was in the 17th century. I think these duplicate the two on the other side, and they're those kind of jug or vessel-like finials on top. What I talked about is not only did the water dump into there, but notice how it troughed there and probably dropped into this trough, which was filled with water and would have been used for drinking by animals. And we've seen the same structure. What I don't see here is the angled washboard type element. We're now at Plaza Roma. We're now at Plaça Nova. Don't know what that church is back there. I'm sure we'll discover it's probably the cathedral. But what's most interesting here are these two towers, two Roman towers that would have flanked the main drag and still do today. Starting from the bottom, some of the lower stones in the bottom would be original Roman. Everything else has been rebuilt. Notice how buildings have been incorporated right into the tower. Of course, the Roman wall extends further on to the left there. This was the main entrance, or one of the main defensive entrances into the original Roman town of Barcino. And here at the base of the left-hand tower is a remnant restored of a Roman aqueduct that brought water from the surrounding hills into this old town a couple of thousand years ago, diverting it once inside the town, one half of it to the population and one half to the business enterprises or industry enterprises of this Roman city. This is a drawing and an outline of the old city, Roman city. Here's where we're at right now. We'll be going further on into that. Interesting to wonder what the indentations in old stone walls is, or was for, like that long vertical line. What caused that? What was its purpose? And this block up here, and two of them, actually, unless it was one that's been separated. No, it's two separate ones, but they are different colors than the rest of the wall, each with some kind of indentations. Whether that was legible as language or not, I don't know. Whether that is an artifact that's for real, like I think it portends of an arch, that there would have been an archway between these two towers, which does make sense. Many structures, including these towers, while most of the tower is not original, are based, and literally, on these big, huge Roman stones. Even to the extent that elsewhere I've seen later buildings constructed on those bases for the very stability of them. Now, this building opposite the towers is the modern Catalan College of Architects, but the frieze was designed by Picasso. Looks like a boat, a face, a little bird maybe, who knows? Two people playing something, instruments. Panel supposedly showing kings waving branches, and here children participating in a celebration. And Rick comments that Picasso used to frequent the brothels not too far away from here. I think that's an interesting fact. I've always wanted to paint. Okay, what we are looking at is the facade of the cathedral. Now this style is called flamboyant French. The flamboyant means flames. And what it refers to, interestingly enough, because I've seen this and wondered why it was what it was, is this prickly spiders, if you will, these little flanges that stick out, are supposed to give the impression of sparkling, flickering, religious flames, if you will, of passion or fervor or whatever. As Rick points out, this facade, while the church may date from like the 14th century, the facade is actually neo-Gothic in the sense of 19th century, but that it represents a catalog, if you will, of Gothic detail. And we'll look at some of that. Large, good-looking gargoyles. This pointed archway itself, of course, is classic Gothic, as are all these pointy arches, windows, if you will. I don't know why robed statues are Gothic, but he says they are. And winged angels on these bell towers. And again, notice that flaming effect, or what's supposed to be a flaming effect. And probably that see-through, hollowed out peak is again reminiscent of a flame that you can perhaps see through parts of it. But the angels are everywhere, aren't they, though? Lest we forget, notice that here are statues in place as opposed to just a vacant cavity with the umbrella type head and the pedestal to stand on with nothing in it. Here we have completion all the way around. So what happened to those other statues? Ripped out, destroyed, put in palatial estates. This dome is directly over the entrance as you come in. You get a sense of old and grimy. Certainly authentic. Certainly the massive columns and that fluting drives your eyes directly up. There's a different feel in here because it's so old and unrestored. Here, just to do it, down the left aisle. Some pretty stained glass that I'll pan across to get. Here are the spires on the chairs of the choir. And notice this cute little stairway that takes you up to the higher level on the choir for some reason. Why? Because that's a pulpit, I think. I wonder what these little hooky things are for. Almost look like coat hangers. These rather simple, at least down below compared to what we've seen. They're just painted on. A little bit of carving. Here, nothing dramatic. The most magnificent carving is those steeples above the seats. Imagine you can walk up there. Here I'm standing at what is somewhat of a quasi-transept, looking at that dome over the altar. A beautiful stained glass that no one ever sees up close. Why Kenny G is playing in the background, I don't know. Here the organ is embedded in a niche right over the left transept as you're facing the altar. It's interesting location for it. Some very beautiful stained glass. I'll pick up a couple of the panels. I thought that purple was very pretty. I'll get closer to it in a moment. You can well imagine that a person who visits this church frequently as a parishioner finds a spot in the church that makes them feel most comfortable during a service, most elated. There must be someone who loves this spot. Look at the view you have of the cross, stained glass, priest. Maybe you have to be asked. The church has 28 of these side chapels, all built by the various guilds as a way of displaying their wealth. In other words, not by the nobility, but by the merchant class. That's an interesting and novel status that I had not encountered before. Finally recognized a biblical story. This is the character that God told to kill his son, and he's about ready to knife him. The knife's been broken off when an angel stops him, realizing that he was fully prepared to slice his son's neck, which he has his hand around or near. A little interesting tidbit I didn't realize about these partial sitting and standing little chairlets, if you will, is that because you couldn't put anything religious on something you're going to sit, God forbid your butt would be on it for obvious reasons, you could then, as an artist, free to put any whimsical, non-religious thing you wanted on it.